Thank you, Sean. Well, officially, thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to be here virtually and see old friends and new friends and so on. As I said before, I really don't mind being interrupted. It's possible virtually. It's not smooth, but it can work. So let me tell you what I want to do, and then I'll tell you how I'm going to do it, or I try to anyway. What I want to do is tell you what an impossible world is. Of course, many people have talked about impossible worlds, but I think it's true to say that the notion of an impossible world has been more by sort of example than by definition at the moment. And I'm going to try and give you a definition. And moreover, I want this to be a logic neutral definition. So I don't want it to depend on any particular logic or account of logic. I want to try and sell you an account which is going to be acceptable whatever you think the right logic is. So that's my mission, to tell you what an impossible world is. So how are we going to do this? Okay, so I'm going to give you a very brief historical background first. Most of you will know this, but it will at least contextualize what is going. And then to answer the question, I need to answer it for two distinct sorts of impossible worlds. First of all, for those of a formal semantics, and for those of not this formal semantics, but whatever the worlds of the formal semantics represent in reality. Worlds themselves, not just the mathematical simulacra thereof. And as you'll see, those two things require different answers, and the second one is going to be much harder. So in section 3, I'll give you the answer for formal semantics. Then in section 4, I'll talk about worlds themselves. Before I do that, I'm going to have to tell you what I take a logic to be for the purpose of today's talk. So that's section 2. If that's all I get through, that's not a problem. The rest is, in a certain sense, mopping up. So section 5 is about iterating the construction involved to higher orders. And then there's a bunch of things to do with compactness and logical pluralism and some of the tasking conditions. So those things are in sections 5 and 6. But you know, they're nice optional extras. But by the end of section 4, we've got the guts of things. So, okay, so that's where we're going. So let's start with the historical background. So, as I'm sure most of you know, modal logic has been discussed, investigated in all the three great periods of logic in the West: ancient Greek, medieval, and modern logic. And in the modern period, it was sort of brought to prominence by C.I. Lewis in the early 20th century. But I think that it's fair to say that by the 1950s, it had a bad reputation because of attacks by people like Quine. And then, you know, this guy came along. So you may not recognize this, except that it says who it is at the top. So this is Saul. It's about 1975, I don't know the exact date. So it's about a decade and a half after the works on world semantics. And what Saul did in the papers on world semantics was to give, you know, a very coherent, tractable, powerful semantics for some of the Lewis systems. I don't think that the Quinean animadversions were really answered. They just kind of faded out as irrelevant. So the Kripke semantics proved to be such a powerful piece of logical machinery that it was soon finding all kinds of applications, not just in modality, but in counterfactuals, property theory, philosophy of language, you name it. Okay. Now, the first two of Saul's papers were on the Lewis systems S4 and S5, which I guess are now called normal systems. But some of the weaker systems of Lewis, S2 and S3, are non-normal. Proof theoretically, what makes them non-normal is that the rule of necessitation fails. So this holds in all normal systems, but it fails in the non-normal systems. And after the first couple of papers by Saul, he came up with semantics for S2 and S3, which were non-normal. And these deployed a new kind of world, which he called non-normal. The trick was to get necessitation to fail. And he did this by allowing the truth conditions of modal formulas to behave differently. So at the normal world, the truth conditions involved a binary accessibility relation, but at non-normal worlds, they were given differently, in fact, in blanket terms. But the upshot of these semantics was that at the non-normal worlds, some logical truths might fail. So there's one, box A and not A. And some logical falsehoods, such as it's possible that A and not A may hold. So it's kind of natural to think of these worlds as impossible worlds, because impossible things, classically impossible things, can happen. So this was where impossible worlds started, although Saul didn't call them that. But after the invention of the semantics for non-normal modal logics, the use of impossible worlds were found to have, well, the technique was found to have many, many different applications. And a major one was in the semantics of relevant logics, where you get what are effectively the normal worlds and the non-normal worlds, where logical truths may fail and logical falsehoods may hold. Of course, in the semantics of relevant logics, the impossible worlds are still well behaved in a certain sense. Namely, they're closed under modus ponens for logical truths of the form A or B. So they're not completely anarchic. But in other constructions which use impossible worlds, particularly those concerning intentional notions like belief, desire, etc., etc., the worlds can be much more anarchic. And in fact, in the most general case, an impossible world can be completely anarchic in the sense that any combination of formulas can hold or fail. So whatever impossible worlds are, their impossibility can be of different kinds, and some can be more anarchic than others. All right, now I think it's fair to say that if you're going to give a world semantics for anything that involves hyperintensional notions, then you're going to have to use impossible worlds. So that thrusts the question of what an impossible world is to the forefront. And as I said earlier, I think it's fair to say that the notion has been used more by example than by definition till now. So that's what I want to rectify. I'm not interested in the metaphysical status of possible worlds. I'm not interested in what the right logic is. I'm simply interested in a definition of an impossible world that can be acceptable to everybody. So that's the background. Let me stress that I'm talking about logical possibility and impossibility. There are, of course, many notions of possibility and impossibility, epistemic, natural, maybe metaphysical. I'm not interested in those. I'm interested in logical possibility and impossibility. That's all that's on the agenda. So since I'm talking about logical possibility and impossibility, I should tell you what I think a logic is, at least for the purpose of today's talk. And let me say that by logic here, I'm just going to talk about deductive logic, because that's been the home of logically impossible worlds. So what is a deductive logic? Well, no big surprises here. We're going to fix a language L, and for the most part, you can think of this as some kind of standard propositional language. A logic is a relation, I'll write as turnstile, between pi and gamma, where pi and gamma are sets of formulas of L, and I'm going to take them to be finite. If the logic is compact, that's no real restriction. If we get round to some of the option extras, I might talk about the infinite case, but let's just keep things simple for the moment, and let's take logic to be a relationship between finite sets of premises and conclusions. So you can think of this as meaning something like, if all the members of pi are true, then some of the members of gamma are true. You know, the usual multiple conclusion understanding. Okay, now, should there be other constraints on a consequence relation? Well, it's normal to put other constraints on a consequence relation. The standard ones are the kind of tasky constraints. So there's reflexivity, you can stutter. There's monotonicity, you can beef up your premises and conclusions. And of course, there's transitivity, AKA cut. So those are the tasky conditions, and I'm going to assume those. If we get around to the optional extras at the end, I'll talk about how you can get rid of them. But for most of the purposes of today, you can just, but by logic, I'm going to mean a consequence relation satisfying those conditions. Now, there is another constraint that's sometimes put on a consequence relation, which is closure under substitution. So if A is some formula and F is a map from propositional parameters into the formulas of A, then A of S will denote A with every propositional parameter substituted by, every propositional parameter P substituted by S of P. And if sigma is a set of formulas, sigma S is just the A of S's for all the A's in sigma. That's standard. And closure under substitution is that if pi turnstile gamma, then for any S, pi S turnstile gamma S. Now, I will mention substitution briefly later, but in fact, I'm not going to assume that. But it is a sort of standard constraint on something that counts as a consequence relation. Anyway, so that's that part of the talk. So again, that's background. That's just telling you how I'm going to understand what a logic is for the purpose of today's talk. Okay, so that's all the background. And now I want to address the main problem, which is what is an impossible world? To address that question, I need to draw a distinction, which I don't think people often draw. And I think it confuses a lot of the discussions. So my question is, what is a logically impossible world? And the answer is going to be different depending on whether you're talking about the worlds of a form of semantics or whatever it is in reality that the worlds of the form of semantics, which are just sets of certain kinds, are supposed to represent. So worlds in grey. Now, I'm not really interested in what those worlds are, what kind of thing those worlds are. As you know, that's contentious. What I have to say will be neutral on that issue. But the definition of an impossible world is going to be very different depending on whether you're dealing with the worlds of formal semantics or the worlds in grey, for reasons that will become clear as we go along. So let's take the worlds of a formal semantics first, because the answer is easier there. Okay, so the situation is this. Assume that we've got a world semantics for some logic turnstile. And let's suppose that validity is defined as truth preservation at all possible worlds or models. All right, question, which are the possible worlds? Well, that sounds like a no-brainer, right? It's the ones that are, truth is preserved over in the definition of validity, okay? And that's, I think, pretty much the right answer. So let me make that a bit more precise. The possible worlds are going to be those that are closed under turnstile. Okay, so W is going to be a possible world just if. Well, this says if pi entails gamma and everything in pi is true at W, then something in gamma is true. Okay, that's just to say that W is closed under the consequence relation. So that's a possible world, one that's closed under the consequence relation. Of course, that does depend on the consequence relation, but I'm not assuming anything about the consequence relation other than what I've said. And a world is impossible if it's not possible. Now, I don't know that there's too much that's contentious about this, but there are some wrinkles. So let me just note a couple of wrinkles. It could be that some worlds seem to end up in the wrong place under this definition. So how can that happen? Well, here's one way it can happen. In some constructions, for some logics, impossible worlds can be entirely anarchic. Okay, anything can hold or fail at those worlds. And so it could be that an impossible world, or world that's technically called impossible, non-normal if you like, is in fact closed under the consequence relation. So in the semantics, a world that is technically classified as non-normal comes out as possible under my definition. That can happen, but I don't really think this is a big deal, because if you've got such a world, you can just move it. You can sort of slide it out of the non-normal worlds into the normal worlds. It's not going to change anything, just because the fact that truth is preserved in that world means it's not going to change the consequence relation. So, yeah, you might have to do a bit of fiddling, a bit of moving things which are technically non-normal into the normal worlds, but I don't think that's a big deal. I think you could have had that. You could have had a world of that kind in possible worlds anyway. Another reservation you might have is this: there can be a trivial. In some logics, there can be a trivial world where everything holds, and of course, its flip side, the empty world where nothing holds. Now, according to my definition, those have to be possible worlds. And you might balk at this. You might sort of balk at the trivial world being a possible world. Look, if you don't like it, just make those special cases, make the trivial world impossible by definition. But actually, I don't think that's the right way to go, because the definition of the impossible world is modulo a consequence relation. And in those logics in which there really is a trivial world, I think, or an empty world, same thing, I think it's really what one should really think of those worlds as logically possible. I mean, there's nothing in those worlds which is ruled out by logic. Okay, so you can make those worlds a special case if you want, but my inclination is to say, well, for the logics that permit a trivial or an empty world, yeah, okay, those worlds really are possible. So that's one observation about my definition. Second observation, impossible worlds are not closed under the consequence relation in question, but of course it's entirely possible that they can be closed under a weaker consequence relation. So I already talked about, for example, the worlds of the impossible worlds of relevant logic, which aren't completely anarchic. They satisfy certain closure conditions. So the fact that I've given you a definition of the impossible world doesn't mean that all impossible worlds are of the same kind. Some can be more anarchic than others. It just depends how many or how powerful constraints there are on those impossible worlds. So impossibility can come by degrees, I guess. So observation 1 and observation 2 are kind of wrinkles. The definition I've given you is not completely anodyne. It does have the features that I just pointed out, but I think essentially it's the right answer. And now I'll go out on a limb and say I don't think that there's anything terribly contentious about the story so far. Which takes us to the harder question, I think. So, I've told you what an impossible world is when we've got a form of semantics which has a consequence relation. Okay, now I want to give you an account of what an impossible world is when one is dealing with worlds themselves. Now, why is this different? Well, because the first answer I gave you just now assumed that we had a consequence relation to deal with. If you're dealing with worlds themselves, you haven't got one, or at least you haven't got one built into the machinery. You've got to extract one somehow. And really, the interesting part of the construction is really extracting a consequence relation. So that's the important thing about where we're going. So let's see how we get there. So where do we start? So assume we've got a totality of worlds, one of which I'll write as at, is actual. The aim is to say in a logic neutral way, or at least in a way which doesn't assume anything about the particular logic. We're not assuming classical logic or intuitionist logic or anything. The aim is to say which of the worlds are possible and which of the worlds are impossible. Okay. Now, I'm taking my inspiration from a parallel question about not logical impossibility, but physical impossibility. And it's not entirely obvious how you define a physically impossible world. But what I'm working with is the thought that a physically impossible world is a world where the natural laws are different from the laws of the actual world. So what makes a world physically impossible? Well, it's just that the physical or natural laws at that world are different from the actual physical world laws. We can come back and argue about that if you like, but that's where I'm starting from. And I want to give the analogous answer for logically impossible worlds. So a logically impossible world is a world where the logical laws are different from the logical laws of the actual world. Okay, that's the obvious analog. Now, of course, there's a debate in philosophy of science about how you define the natural laws. How do you distinguish them from contingent universal generalizations? I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to talk about physical possibility and impossibility, but we don't have to face that question. But what we do have to face is the analogous question for logical laws. So what makes something a logical law of a world, as opposed to, if you like, a sort of contingent universal generalization? That's the hard problem. So that's the problem that I need to really get stuck into. Now, what I'm going to do is explain what a logical law is. And again, I'm going to define it in terms of the relation W forces A, that is, A holds at W. But now I have no formal semantics to play with. So there are no things such as interpretations. And so I'm going to have to assume that the language now is an interpreted language. I don't see any way around that, okay? There's nothing else I think one can do. So I'm going to give the definition of possibility and impossibility in terms of W forces A, but the A is now a formula or a sentence of an interpreted language. All right, so now we do the hard work. First of all, definition. Turnstile is an extrinsic logic of W, just if, well, it preserves truth at W. Now, you've seen that definition before, or at least something that looked similar. It means something a little bit different now because we're dealing with an interpreted language, but turnstile is an intrinsic logic of W just if it preserves truth at W. Okay, so far so good. Now, as would be pretty obvious if you think about it for a minute, extrinsic logics are not unique. Because if turnstile is an intrinsic logic, then any sublogic is going to be an extrinsic logic too. So extrinsic logics are not unique. Let me just say at this point that I'm assuming that a world has one logic. Now, if you are a logical pluralist, you may balk at this. And again, if we get around to the optional extras at the end of the talk, I'll address this, but let's keep things simple for now. I'm assuming that every world has a unique logic, just as every world, I assume, has a unique set of laws of nature. And what we've just seen is that intrinsic logic, and the world has many intrinsic logics, okay? So we've got to zero in on one of these as the intrinsic logic. Now, the first few things that you might think of aren't going to work. So what I did was to define what an extrinsic logic is. So an extrinsic logic is something which preserves truth, or the extrinsic logic of a world is something that preserves truth at that world, in whatever language you want to use. Okay, now, extrinsic logics are obviously not unique. So we've got to zero in on one of them. And the first thought that you're likely to have is that you want the weakest or the strongest. And that's pretty useless because the weakest is the one with where nothing follows from anything. And the strongest is simply the one that's materially truth preserving at W. And those are, well, pretty boring. We've got to do something a little more than that. Okay. And you might think, well, one might rule those things out or something like them by requiring substitution under, by requiring closure under substitution. But that's not going to cut it either. Because in the case of natural necessity or natural laws, there's this distinction between natural laws and contingent universal generalizations. And a similar idea is going to work here. There can be some things which are truth preserving, which are only so by accident, as it were. So let me give you a couple of examples. Let's suppose that you're using a paraconsistent logic, and that there are some worlds which are contradictory. Maybe they're impossible, maybe they're not. Let's leave that aside for a moment. But let's suppose that the actual world is consistent. Okay. So if you consider the inference from P and not P to Q, then that's going to be truth preserving at the actual world, but it's not going to be logically valid. It's a kind of contingent generalization, as it were. And the example has nothing much to do with paraconsistency. So there's an old debate about well, it was sort of produced by Etchemendy many years ago about logical consequence and task conditions and so on. And what Etchemendy pointed out was things can be truth preserving because of contingent features of a world which are not logically valid. So suppose your actual world has exactly one thing in it. Then the inference P, so there's one thing, is going to be truth preserving at the actual world, and obviously closed under substitution. But you still wouldn't want it to be logically valid. So closing under substitution ain't going to help either. Okay. So those are the first things you might think of, and they don't work. So we're going to have to do something a bit different. Okay. This is what we're going to do. Physical lawlikeness can be expressed modally. Okay. So what makes something a law of special relativity is not just that nothing does accelerate through the speed of light, but nothing can accelerate through the speed of light. So you've got a modal term there. All right. So you can express physical lawlikeness with modal operators. Trouble is you can't do the same thing with logical lawlikeness. Simply because logical modality is not sufficient to give you what you want. For example, in some paraconsistent logics, you can arrange for everything to be possible. You just have a trivial world. So in those logics, you can have the same modalities, as it were, but they're still different logics. So you cannot define logical lawlikeness in terms of modality. That would be nice. The trouble is that logical consequence is essentially relational. So you need to do something which is essentially relational, otherwise you have got a hope in hell. All right. So how do we do this? Well, I'm going to extend the language with a new connective, okay? And it's going to be a multi-grade connective, by which I mean that, okay, so the new connective is double arrow, but it can have any finite number of formulas on its left and any finite number of formulas on its right. Okay, so this is where the fact that you're dealing with a finite consequence relation is really doing some hard work. Okay, so we extend the language with this new multi-grade connective, where the A's and the B's, the things on either side of the double arrow, are formulas of L. I'm going to do this to be able to express consequence relationships between formulas of L. Okay, and I'm going to call the extended language L with a superscript double arrow. Okay. And I'm going to use the double arrow to single out one intrinsic consequence relation from all the extensional consequence relations. And it's going to work like this. I'm going to call a world coherent if it has an extrinsic logic, turnstile W, such that W makes A1 through AM, arrow B1 through BM hold, just if B1 through Bn really is a consequence of A1 through AM according to W. So what that's saying is that the true double arrow sentences in W really express or track this particular extrinsic logic. Okay. Now, if a world is coherent, then the extrinsic logic expressed by double arrow is the intrinsic logic of the world. So I'm using the double arrow to single out one of the extrinsic logics syntactically by allowing it to be expressible in, well, not L, but a slight extension of L. Okay. Now, the double arrow statements, which are actually true, and I'll take no line at all on what those are, those statements are truth preserving at arrow. I take it that any true logic, any true consequence expression has to be truth preserving at the actual world, or what the hell is it doing, okay? So the true arrow statements, the ones which are actually true, have got to be truth preserving at the actual world. So you can read the biconditional from left to right to pick out the appropriate extrinsic logic, ensuring that the actual world is indeed coherent. Okay. So with all that background, finally, the answer. W is a possible world if it's, first of all, coherent, and it has the same intrinsic logic as the actual world. So I've now explained what the intrinsic logic of the actual world is, and a world is going to be possible if it too is coherent, and moreover, it has the same intrinsic logic. So remember the definition of physical, a physical law, something that is a, well, the definition of physical possibility. A world is physically possible if it has the same physical laws as the actual world. Well, this is now the analog, but in terms of logic. But we had to work to get the logic of the actual world out. And of course, that's what a possible world is. And an impossible world is just a world that isn't possible. Okay. So, two observations about this. First of all, observation one. Let's assume that there's a modal box in the language, and that box A is true at a world if A is true at all possible worlds. That's sort of S5-ish. Then where the double arrow expresses the intrinsic logic of A at, if at makes that conditional true, then at makes the box of it true too, just because if it's true at the actual world, it's going to be true at all possible worlds. So that's something that's nice, something you hope to get, certainly. A bit more interesting, impossible worlds can be of different kinds. Now, I've already commented on the fact that impossible worlds can be of different kinds. They can be different degrees of unlikeness, as it were. But the construction adds a new possibility here, because some impossible worlds are going to be coherent. That is, truth is closed under the intrinsic logic of the world. So the world has an intrinsic logic, it's just not the same as the actual world. Okay. But there's another possibility, that the worlds could be incoherent, where the true arrow statements don't even preserve truth of the world. So there might be a world where you've got true statements of logic, but they're crazy. They just don't preserve truth of the world. And if you think about impossible worlds for a moment, you should sort of expect that, precisely because at impossible worlds, in principle, anything can happen, right? So at impossible worlds, you might expect that the true laws of logic don't preserve truth. That can happen. So given this construction, there are at least going to be two different kinds of impossible worlds, coherent ones, but where the intrinsic logic is not the same, as the actual world, and just incoherent worlds, the much more anarchic ones. Okay, so we've got to, I've given you the answer that I propose. The rest, as I said, are kind of frills and optional extras. Well, I'll tell you what the frills are. So obviously, I've started with a language L, and in the interesting case, I've extended it by a new connective. And you might want to say, well, yes, of course, but now you've extended the language, the same issue is going to arise. So how do you tell the same story about the extended language? Well, the answer is you essentially do the same thing, but then of course you can keep going. So there's a hierarchy looming here. You can in fact do the same kind of construction all throughout the hierarchy. So there's nothing really new about this. I mean, if you've got your head around the zeroth order construction, you can probably sit down and work out the hierarchy for yourself in 20 minutes. So I'll hammer through the details if you like, but I don't think there's anything conceptually very new in this. That's the stuff on higher orders. The last section dealt with a bunch of kind of disparate points. One was what to say about consequence relations once compactness fails. One was what to say about logical pluralism, and one was what to say about getting rid of some of the Tarski conditions. Maybe that's a bit more interesting, but there's nothing profound there. So let me not do the higher order stuff, because it's kind of technically interesting, but there's really nothing conceptually novel there. Let me talk about moving to non-compact languages, because actually that might sound technical too, but it does raise some interesting issues. Okay, so, so I assumed in the talk that we had a consequence relation between finite premises and finite conclusions. And if you think about it, that played a crucial role in the construction, because I defined the intrinsic logic by saying which was the extrinsic logic, which was internally characterized, or at least linguistically characterizable. And so the characterization, this is a finite language, so the characterization of the consequence relation has to be expressed with a finite number of premises and a finite number of conclusions. Okay, suppose that's now no longer the case. Suppose you really do need to take into account non-compact logic seriously, but you can't simply reduce the infinite case to the finite case. What do you do? Okay, well, look, one thing that you could do, and this is the most straightforward generalization, is that, okay, let me not spoil this. First, the most obvious thing to do is to move to an infinitary logic. So we relax the syntax in such a way that you can have an infinite number of things on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the arrow. And you might have to fiddle with things like, okay, apologies for that. I think the line dropped out at my end. These things happen sometimes when you're working virtually. It's one of the new facts of life. I don't know where exactly the line dropped out, but I was talking about how you move to a non-compact logic. And the obvious thing is that you can make the double arrow an infinitary connective. And I was just saying something when I think the line dropped out, which was double arrow is a multigrade connective. Now, you do meet multigrade stuff in logic sometimes, but normally you meet it as in terms of predicates. So multigrade predicates are well known. Multigrade connectives, I don't know anyone who's ever talked about multigrade connectives before. So I had to kind of invent this. If anyone knows about multigrade connectives that I don't know, then I'll be very happy to learn. But anyway, if you're dealing with non-compact logics, one way is to move from this finite tree multigrade connective to an infinite tree multigrade connective. Okay, that's one thing you can do. That's technically unfamiliar, but you can do something which is technically much more familiar, in fact. I said you can think of that we're dealing with a propositional language, but let's now suppose you've got the first order language at your disposal. Okay, then things get reasonably straightforward. So let's move to an appropriate first order logic. You can now express the intrinsic character of logic by this very simple condition. So again, we've got lots of extrinsic consequence relations, but we can now take double arrow to be a binary predicate. Okay. So I'm assuming we can talk about, we've got a language which is appropriate to talk about premises and sets thereof, so ZF or something like this. Now you can define the intrinsic logic simply by this formula, the name of pi, arrow, name of gamma, where that's a binary predicate. And the angle brackets are a name forming functor. So it's not even multigrade anymore, it's a simple binary predicate. So you don't actually have to, okay, you can stay within the realms of the non-multigrade once you move to a first order scenario. Something else that's kind of interesting about this particular scenario is this. Suppose that your language is that of Zumino-Frankel set theory, ZF, or as I'm now learning to call it, because of blank looks and misunderstanding, ZF. All right. Now, of course, in ZF, you can define the consequence relation for most logics that I know. So if that's right, you can actually define this binary predicate in the language of ZF. Whatever you think the right logic is, you can define it in ZF. So when I briefly talked about higher orders, I pointed out that because as I'd set things up, the double arrow is not a connective in the language, you've got to add it. And this generates a hierarchy. But once you move to a first order language, and if it's the language of something like Zumino-Frankel set theory, you're not going to get this hierarchy simply because you can define the intrinsic consequence relation in terms of ZF. So it's definable in the language. So you don't get this hierarchy. I think that's the most interesting point. Look, of all the option extras, I think that's the most interesting thing. So let me wind up. Look, what I've been trying to do in this talk is give you a definition of what an impossible world is. And I've tried to do this in such a way that it's not committed to any one particular logic. Construction is neutral with respect to that. You can plug in your favorite logic, whatever that is. Of course, there are lots of things about impossible worlds that this definition will not answer. It won't tell you anything about the metaphysical status of impossible worlds. Won't tell you what constructions to use them in. But if we're going to use impossible worlds of some kind in some construction, at least I hope that what I've been doing will tell us what it is we're talking about, which is always a good thing to know. So, thank you.